Successful podcasts have strong podcast hosts. They engage the audience, interact with potential guests, and lead everyone throughout the episode. One could say your podcast host is the backbone of your show. If listeners don't like your host, they probably aren't going to stay around for long. So picking the right podcast host or co-host is a really big deal. And today we're going to discuss how to find great podcast hosts and how to keep them. Take it away, Mr. Radio Man.
Podcast Your Business.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Podcast Your Business. I'm Sunny Galt. I'm a podcast coach and mentor, and I have been doing the whole podcasting thing for about 17 years. I believe that makes me an early adopter. And I am currently the founder and the CEO of a company called Independent Podcast Network. You can look us up at the longest URL in history, which is independentpodcast.network. And we've got a lot of free resources for podcasters, and we also partner with podcasters who are interested in making money with their shows. But today, I am here to help you create amazing podcasts, especially for those of you who are podcasting for your business. And we do this by mastering
the 5 P's of podcasting.
Yeah, the 5 P's of podcasting. So I created these 5 P's, or I organized them together and started really promoting the 5 P's when I launched my first podcast course, which was back in 2020, right about the time the whole pandemic thing started. Most people were going crazy. I was like, this is the perfect time to launch my first course. And the 5 P's are prep, plan, produce, promote, and profit. And I believe if you master these and the topics that we talk about that fall within these 5 Ps, then you are bound to have a successful podcast. And there's a lot of different ways to podcast, and that's kind of what we explore on these episodes. But each episode, we pick a different P. So, Mr. Radio Man, which of the 5 Ps are we talking about today?
Plan.
Yeah, so after you have determine that you are going to do this whole podcasting thing. That's what we talk about when we talk about prep. When we talk about plan, you're really going more in depth into the look and feel for your podcast. And that includes who's going to host your show. So that's why we're talking about finding the right podcast host today. So let's run through some of the things that you're going to learn and that we're going to discuss on today's episode. We're going to talk about the importance of finding the right podcast host. Now, you may think, you need to have a really good host, but there's a little bit more to it than that. And so I want to break it down for you as to why this is as important as it is. It's not just a voice that is on a show. There's a lot more behind that in the connection that that person brings to your audience and therefore to your podcast. So we'll explore that. We're also going to discuss what a podcast host is and what they do. And that does kind of depend on the format for your show, but we'll dive into that a little bit more. We're going to talk about different places and ways for you to look for a podcast host. So if you've made that decision that you need to find a host, there's a whole different, a whole lot of ways that you can do that. And I'm also going to bring in some of my personal experience of what has worked for me. Heads up, I have brought in a lot of different podcast hosts for a lot of different projects, and I kind of found them all in different ways. So I've got some personal experience to share with you on that. And then we're going to talk about something. We're going to talk about keeping your podcast host because, it's kind of like finding a job, and everyone preps to find a job. And how do I find the right job? And then how do I get the job? But no one really talks about how to keep a job. So I kind of view this in that category. Once you find the host and you've determined that it's going to work out, at least from your perspective, things are working out really well. How do you keep your podcast host and keep your podcast host happy? Those could be 2 different things. All right, we're going to get started on all this great content right after this quick break. Every podcast needs a podcast host. And that could be you, right? You can host your own podcast, but sometimes that is not the best idea. If you are running your own business, you may not feel like you have enough time to host a podcast. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we hit some of these bullet points that we're going to talk about today. But if you fall into that category and you have a small business, you should probably host your own podcast because you really are your brand at that point. And it may look a little weird for you to just bring in one person. If you run the whole company, right, and you're bringing in one person to host your podcast, that may look a little weird. If you are part of a larger company, though, then it can make more sense. Or perhaps you are planning to host, but you're looking for a co-host to banter with on the show. Maybe you want some help in preparing for the episodes. Those are all great reasons to have a co-host. But either way, if you fall into those categories, you are in the market for a podcast host. And this is a really important job, if you will, for your show. And you don't want to mess it up. So I want to give you some helpful tips today to keep you on track and to help you not only find the best host, but keep them, make them happy, and therefore you are happy and your business thrives, or whatever the goal is for your podcast. We want you to achieve your podcast goals. So let's talk about the importance of finding the right podcast host. Now, in podcasting, if you're not as familiar with podcasting, if this is more new to you, this is what people say. People say you find the shows based on the content, but people stay for the host. Does that make sense? In other words, let's say you're looking for a podcast and you know it needs to be a financial show. You know, you're trying to get your money matters like all straightened out and you need a financial podcast. Well, you may go to a podcasting app and type in certain keywords related to finance. That's how you find the show usually. And then you start listening to some shows and you're going to find out really quickly if you bond with the host. So, you know, I could find, a bunch of podcasts that are focused on finance, but I may only find one or two that I really like the host. And that's what's going to keep me staying and listening to that show week after week, which is why we say people find the shows based on content, but they stay for the host. So you need to find a host that is a good fit for your podcast. And I've said this before on this show, but keep in mind, listening to a podcast, I consider this to be an intimate experience. Now, think about how you're listening to me right now. Are you listening with earbuds in your ears? Are you listening through your computer terminal? You probably are not listening to this with a group of people. This is not like television or radio that you just have playing in your car. This is really a one-on-one experience. And as a result, especially if you are coming through someone's earpods or AirPods, if you've got the wireless ones, you are literally inside their head, literally. And that is a personal experience. Well, you don't want anyone just inside your head, right? So again, this is why finding the podcast host that works really well with you and with your content and with your audience, why that is so important, because they are naturally going to have to build this bond with your audience. So what is a podcast host and what do they do? Well, this really depends on the format for your show, and I'm going to give you some examples here. If you had a solo show, Podcast Your Business is a solo show. I don't have guests on this show. I've been podcasting for a long time. I love helping podcasters, and that's why I do this show. I want you guys to be successful in creating your own podcast. So this is one of those solo shows. It would be really weird for me to hand this podcast off to somebody else because, in the beginning part of today's episode, I was telling you I run a business called Independent Podcast Network. Well, that's a small business. And it's pretty much me and a few freelancers that are running the whole network. And so if I were to hand that off to someone else, someone may be like, what's going on here? This is really Sunny's business. So why is she handing off her podcast? So if it's a solo show like that, you may not want anybody else hosting the podcast if you're a small business. Again, if it's a little bit bigger, you've got multiple people, and maybe you're not even the owner of the business. Maybe you're just in marketing and you came across this podcast. Then it's not so strange, right, to bring in someone from the outside because it's not as tied to the person's image and branding of a particular person. So that's for, a solo show. And when you are the host of a solo show, you are very, very much involved in all elements of the podcast. Podcast your business. I designed the artwork. Well, I didn't come up with the title part of the artwork, but for the photo for this artwork for this podcast, I set it up on a tripod, took about 100 pictures, picked the best one, brought it into Photoshop. I have done everything for the show. I do all the prep work for the shows. I do the handouts and a lot of the extra material that we create, that we give you guys at the end of each episode. I create all of that. And so it really is me. Like, this show is not going to get done if Sunny is not involved. And that's okay. That is just the structure of it. So you could be super duper involved in everything. And again, that's if you have a solo show and, you have a smaller business. Your format, though, for your show, maybe it's more of an interview style where you are bringing on different guests. I feel like when you start to incorporate more people into a podcast, it becomes less and less about the podcast host. Yes, the audience still needs to bond with the host, but if you have other interesting people on the show, then the focus isn't solely on the host, if that makes sense. But if you are doing more of an interview style, then the host would probably be moderating the show, okay, interacting with guests. You may even have them find topics, or maybe that's a collaborative experience. They may do some script writing if you do that kind of stuff to prepare for your show, which I highly recommend you have some sort of script or outline in advance to go along with each episode, just so everyone's on the same page. So those are some common things. And for the podcasts that I do that are focused on pregnancy and parenting, I talk about those a lot on this show. That is what we do with our hosts, okay? So when I'm bringing on a new host, because I've got 5 different podcasts that fall into that space, and it's kind of its own little network, if you will. So when I bring on a new host, they will definitely help. It's a collaborative kind of experience. We come up with topics together. I have a format already for the script. And so, they kind of come in and I lead them into this and make sure that they're comfortable and all of that. And then my goal, and this doesn't need to be your goal with your show, but my goal is to develop them into not just a host, but more of a producer role, because I have found with our shows that the more they get into really caring about the topics, reaching out to guests, scheduling, like just the more involved they are, if that's what they want to be, the more committed they are and the more excited they get. So that's what I found with my parenting shows. But it follows that kind of interview style, and they get more and more involved the longer that they're with the podcast. But you could have, and maybe not if it's tied to your business, I don't know, maybe there's some shows out there like this, but maybe you have a narrative or scripted show. I think about like the true crime shows or anything that really tells a story. Well, then your host really just needs to be able to connect with your audience, have a good voice, but they're probably not going to be as involved with the production or, the script writing and all of that kind of stuff. You probably need someone that can communicate well, that can speak well, has a nice voice, but that's pretty much it, right? So what a podcast host does, it's kind of all over the map depending on your format, but that gives you an idea. Now let's talk about some different places and ways to look for a podcast host. This may sound crazy, and I've mentioned this on the show before, but the most successful way that I have found podcast hosts without soliciting, really, is to put a jobs page on my website. I don't know how people find this. I have people reaching out, maybe like at least a couple people per month, which for a smaller business like mine. Now, this isn't for Independent Podcast Network. I'm talking about for my parenting podcast. But I have a jobs page there, and I'm kind of like always in the market for podcast hosts. I'm always in the market for producers and sales reps. So I have some generic posts that are on a jobs page. It is in the bottom, I think it's on the bottom of the main navigation. So the bottom portion of our website, it says jobs or New Mommy Media jobs. I can't even remember what it says, something like that. And I have people reaching out all the time. So that has been really successful for me. So I would recommend that you do something like that. Now, that may not work if you need someone right away. That's more like, okay, let's just see what's out there in general. And if someone comes my way, we'll work them into the team kind of thing. So that's worked well for me. Also, consider other colleagues or people that you've collaborated with in the past. Now, for my parenting shows, I didn't even mean to set it up this way, but they turned into a really good resource. They ended up being a really good resource for finding other hosts, because the format of the show was, and is still today, you have a podcast host. You may or may not have an official expert that comes on to talk about whatever the topic is, but then we also have other parents joining in and participating in the content. And the reason we did that is I just thought it would be a much more interesting conversation, not just to have what an expert says, but to have real parents talking about whatever the topic is and providing the real world experience. But what it turned into was a great auditioning platform for other hosts. And a lot of the hosts that I ended up bringing on at later times, like I'd have one host leave and I need to replace a host. The first place that I looked, this was before I had the jobs page, the first place that I would look are other guests that really impressed me. And they didn't even know they were auditioning. Maybe I didn't even know they were auditioning at the time. And that still works today. It was only like a month and a half ago, I reached out to one of our hosts and I said, hey, we need another host for our pregnancy show. And I said, do you have anyone in mind? And she said, oh my gosh, I just had this really great guest on the show. Let me give you her contact information. She sent me the link to the episode so I could hear what the person sounded like and the interaction that the person had on the show. So it worked out really well. But even if you don't have other podcasts to draw from, you probably do have other people that you've worked with in some capacity. Maybe you've seen them present on a stage before. Maybe it's just a, colleague in the office that you get along really well with. So think about people you've already worked with and whether or not they might be a good fit. From there, I would probably branch out and try to find people that are already creating media, some form of media on the topics that your show is about. The best place, the best place is finding other podcasters. So you may find someone who already has a show, but maybe they do a slightly different kind of show and your show's going to be different. So it's not competing podcasts, although I don't really consider any podcast as competition. But there are some people that do, right? So you got to consider that. So other podcasters would be amazing, obviously. But another option is YouTubers. Because if you can do audio and video, then it's usually a lot easier just to break it down for audio. Of course, I'm assuming that your show is going to be an audio podcast. Maybe it is an audio and video podcast. Then YouTubers are fantastic because you know what their setup looks like, you know what their camera looks like, their microphone, and all that good stuff. So look for other YouTubers that are talking about similar topics, and maybe there's some collaborative thing you can do there. And then bloggers, although bloggers, you don't really get a good feel for what their voice sounds like. And, it's a different kind of media. It's a written form of media. So that's not my preference. But you can tell if they are knowledgeable about certain topics, right? And what their cadence is, what their style is. So in theory, that could lead, give you kind of an idea of what a discussion would be like with them. It's not the best, but at least they are already talking about, and you can tell they're passionate about whatever the topic is. And that's one thing that a host needs to bring to the conversation. They have to be interested in the topics. Now, quick sidebar. So for my parenting shows, when I launched these shows, I was right in the thick of having kids, okay? And I primarily hosted our pregnancy show. And it was perfect for me because I was still having babies and all that kind of stuff. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, and I knew that I could no longer host these shows because I was not in the stage of life. And I could tell that I wasn't bringing the same enthusiasm to the content. And I bring that up because you may find that your host is originally a really good fit, whether it's you or somebody else. But then over time, things change. People change. Their priorities change. So even if someone is a good fit in the beginning, it may not work out long term, and that's okay. But you may be looking for a host, even if the perfect host right now is hosting your show. Just kind of keep an open mind with that, because you just never know. And if that happens to be you, be honest with yourself if it's time to take a step back. I had to do that, even though it's my baby. These shows are my babies, and I've been working on them a really long time. But you have to think about what's best for the audience. And I knew I just wasn't able to bring that same enthusiasm that I could before. Another great place to search for people is social media, specifically if there are groups related to whatever your podcast topic is. You can also search podcasting groups, and there are more and more groups out there. Like there's groups on Reddit and Facebook. I don't know about Twitter. LinkedIn is another great place to search for different kind of podcasting groups. You can also just make a general post on your own Facebook profile, let's say, and just tell people, hey, I'm searching for this type of person. These are some of the skill set, the qualities, that they need to have. Please let me know if someone comes to mind. And people can tag, and maybe you can find someone that way. Speaking of LinkedIn, you could also do more of a job post. Now, this has never really worked for me in general. So creating an official job post, something that's not just on my website, but, something that's more official that you post to all of the job boards and things like that, that really hasn't worked for me. But LinkedIn, and I'm not sure if they still do this, but they used to allow you to create job posts for free. And I have found that using LinkedIn, sometimes I use LinkedIn to find guests for the shows too. So that has worked for me in some capacity. So if you are going to do more of an official job post, maybe start with LinkedIn and see if you find what you're looking for there. I just get a little bit nervous when you do the Monsters and Indeeds and Career Builder and all of those. I feel like people are looking for really official jobs with benefits and things like that. Maybe that is what you're offering. And if you are, then that could be a great option for you as well. I just think most people listening to this podcast, even if you are paying someone, it's probably not something that someone's going to quit their day job for, right? One thing I do not recommend is that you partner together, especially if this is for your business, if you're podcasting for your business. I do not recommend that you work with friends and family. It's kind of like opening a business with friends and family. It's just, there's so many things that could go wrong, and you don't want your livelihood or anything that's connected to your livelihood to be based on something that goes south with a friend or a family member. I just don't think it's a really good idea unless it is your spouse. Now that is a personal decision that you have to make. I don't have a spouse that would ever be interested in podcasting, so this is not something I ever think about. But I did actually have a pair, a husband and wife team that I brought on temporarily to do some hosting for Preggy Pals, which is our pregnancy show. And they bantered really good, off of each other. They had a really good time. Now, it didn't quite work out because their schedules kind of got changed and then they couldn't find a time to record. But if it's your spouse, I can see how it can work. And especially, they were pregnant with their first kid and it's a pregnancy show. And it was kind of cool because you could hear what the dad was thinking during the pregnancy and the mom was thinking during the pregnancy. And it was kind of a neat conversation to have. So that's why I think it can kind of work with your spouse. But other than that, at least my recommendation, do not bring in friends and family to either host or co-host your podcast. Now let's talk about how to keep your podcast host. So let's assume that you find somebody, and I do have an example here. You find someone that's absolutely amazing, and you want to keep them for as long as possible because things are going so well. So I had this happen through that job page that I was telling you about, which was incredible. Someone fell out of the sky, through the job page, was a perfect fit for a podcast that I had wanted to. It was on hiatus for a long time. I really wanted to bring it back because it didn't have as many episodes. And it was a podcast focused on moms right after they have their babies for the first year of life. And it only had like 40 some episodes. And I don't know, for some reason, I really wanted to have at least 100 in my head. You know how you get something stuck in your head. So I really wanted to find a host for that. Well, I found a host through someone just emailing through this jobs page. And she was awesome. She actually had a journalism background, which is what I have as well. So the recording process was easy for her. You know, writing scripts was easy. You know, outreaching to guests and finding parents to join her on the show. All of that stuff came very naturally for her. And she, at the time when she first started working, she had a baby. And I think, was she already pregnant? I can't remember. She was pregnant with her second when she came on board. I think she was. And so it was just the perfect stage of life for her. These are topics that she's, you know, dealing with on a regular basis. And so, you know, I wanted to keep her for as long as possible. And I remember thinking in my head, how do I do this? How do I keep her happy? Because there's a lot going on in her life and she was just doing a really good job. So here are some of my recommendations. Once you find someone you really like, these are some things that I think you should do. First, have some sort of an agreement with your host. And the reason you need to do this, well, you need to do this for legal reasons anyway. You don't want anyone running off with the content or saying they own the episodes because their voice is on it, things like that. You need to have control over that. But it's more than that. That you're talking about building a relationship with someone and making sure your host is happy and all of that. And so, you know, it's really more about expectations. Laying out the expectations, which may or may not include payment. Maybe you can compensate them in another way if payment really isn't an option. But laying that out so everybody is on the same page with what is required for this position. And if you run into issues down the road, then you can always point to the contract, you know, just to, again, get everyone on the same page. So I think that that's really important. It does not have to be some expensive, crazy thing that attorneys are involved with. I have a very simple one. I'm totally against legalese. I like to make things as simple as possible and as conversational as possible because this really is about relationship building. Once you have that, it's important to mentor them, especially if you're not involved. So if this is not a co-host situation, and this is not with this example that I'm giving, you know, she was the host and I mentored in the beginning. In the beginning, I was more of the producer, so I would join her for all of the recordings. You know, we would plan out the topics together. I would proof the scripts in advance, so she would create the scripts and write out the questions, find the guests, but there was still an approval process. And, you know, this wasn't to micromanage. This was to let her know, give her valuable feedback on what was going on because we were trying to create a quality product together. And then after you've been doing that a while, you may give them more and more responsibility. So after the first contract period, that's another thing that I want to mention. When it comes to these agreements, my recommendation is to start off with small amounts. Like in the beginning, have like a time limit, if you will, like dates, like this contract runs from this date to this date, or this is for 10 episodes or whatever. But make that very specific because it may not work out for one party, both parties. You know, like my example with the husband and wife team, we set out, and this is what I normally do, is that we're going to do 10 episodes, but, you know, you can leave, you know, with a 30-day notice or, you know, whatever, you know, parameters you want to give them. But you need to have an out, especially in the beginning, just so everyone feels comfortable if they need to exercise that right, okay? And it's not weird for whatever reason. So let's assume they make it through that first contract. For me, what I did after that is things got a little bit more relaxed, okay? So for example, the next agreement, I think it was for a longer period of time. So we still had dates, but it was a little bit longer period of time. And then I would start to give the host a little bit more responsibility as well. So for example, I believe for the second contract, which may have been, I can't even remember how many episodes that was, but I wasn't joining for the recording, so I wasn't doing all the producing. You know, we would create the show topics, But then I wasn't, checking the scripts as much. Like, she knew what she was doing. We had already done all that before. I trusted her. If she had any issues, she reached out to me, and everything was just working really, really well. So at that point, you kind of transition into making sure that your host knows that they are appreciated, because everybody wants to feel appreciated. And it's not like I don't feel like it's an ego thing. You just, if you feel like someone appreciates your work, you're more willing to work harder a lot of times. And, continue to do things even if the situation isn't optimal. So let's say you can't necessarily pay people, but man, you're really fun to work with. And there's these other perks that you've created. You're just creating an overall really enjoyable environment for them to work in. So you need to show ways to appreciate them. For me, some of the things we do pay, but we didn't pay a ton of money. So one of the things that I did is I made sure when we had advertisers that the products, because a lot of times you could sample the products, before we wrote the commercial spot and did all of that. And so I would make sure that the host got the products. So this could mean those, like those meal kits, those put it together, it comes in a box on your doorstep. It could be those kind of meal kits. We had baby monitors. We had different things for your baby. I can't remember all the stuff off the top of my head. I think there was some like really expensive mommy kind of lotions and skincare products. So that's an example of something that you can do. You don't necessarily need to get all that kind of stuff, right? Especially if it could benefit your host, because that's the stage of life that they're in. So think of different ways like that you can send them things, or again, maybe work it into the advertising. Just do nice little things, even if it's just a little note to say, I caught this episode. You did a really good job. I really liked how you did this. Everybody just wants to feel appreciated. I also think you need to communicate on a regular basis. So maybe that's setting up a regular meeting or some sort of internal system so that things don't fall through the cracks. And, you need to set them up for success in every way possible. And then the last thing is, not everything lasts forever. So with this particular host, she had a situation where her family really needed her. And her whole situation with her family changed, where she used to have a lot more time to do this, kind of smaller projects like this. She found herself needing to get a full-time job. And it was very quick. Although I knew she was looking for jobs, the transition happened really quick. And I'll be honest, I really didn't have much of a plan for when she left. The plan was, okay, we're not going to produce that show for a while until someone else finds the job page and, we find another host. I don't know. So I didn't really have an exit plan with that. But if you have someone that's really, really involved and it's really important for your podcast to continue, you need to have some sort of exit strategy, not just with that one person, although that's important too. Like if they have developed their own processes and they have access to all these documents and you don't have access to any of that because they up and left, even if they had the best intentions, that's just the nature of the situation. That kind of leaves you, a little bit on your own. So think about that kind of stuff. Make sure you've got access to the right things. Make sure that you've got a plan. And maybe it is that your show goes on hiatus for a little bit until you find someone else. But knowing that in advance will save you a lot of heartache. All right, so there you go. Those are my tips for today. That's how you find a good podcast host, how you keep them, and how you keep everybody happy. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I've got a freebie for you, so stay tuned. Earlier in today's episode, we were talking about different formats, and we were talking about interview styles and scripting and some of the responsibilities that your show host may have. So that leads us into today's free handout, and the handout is prepare for your podcast recordings with an episode script or outline. That is the official title. It is available on our website for independentpodcast.network. I will include the link below. But what this is a sample episode script, and you can modify it however you want. It's actually on Google Docs, and I believe there is a Word format as well that you can download. But this is about setting your podcast host up for success and creating processes for them so they know what to expect. And I think that having some sort of script for your show, or maybe an elaborate rundown or outline, whatever you want to call it, I think that that's going to be really important because, again, their job is to lead people through an episode. And so there needs to be a plan. So what I'm giving you is what I use for my parenting shows. Obviously, you can change whatever you want because every podcast is a little bit different. But this will at least help you start with something, and you can build from there and adjust as needed. And I actually did a YouTube video on this many years ago, and to date, it is my most popular YouTube video. So a lot of people I know are downloading this. That's great. I love it. So hopefully it will help your show as well. And when you get a chance, head on over to independentpodcast.network. Even if you're not going to download that handout, please head on over to our website. We've got a lot of great blog posts, more podcast episodes like this one. We have videos, more handouts, and we even have whole podcast courses. So whether you're at the beginning stage of your podcast, or maybe you know someone that's interested in getting into podcasting, but they just haven't made that leap yet, all of the content is free. And so have them come to the website. They can take one of our courses or skip around, just watch whatever videos they want, because it really is a great crash course into podcasting, because I want to set you up to be successful. And a great way to be successful is to do your research in the beginning. So check all that good stuff out. Until next week, remember,
podcasts are awesome.